Thank you, David. We're all going to gather in just a moment. I mean, if we want to go ahead and set that up. But while we're bringing out the chairs, first of all, I just want to say candidly that this is challenging my capacity to ask an intelligent question. I don't even know if this is relevant, but I do have a question. You came down to 15 out of 2,000 or 20,000 for Burkitt's lymphoma. Now, in my desperate sprint to keep up with what you were saying, I got the impression that those 15 are the ones that would really excite cancer.
Cancer biologists, not cancer.
Oh, cancer, yes.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe, okay.
Well, those are the ones that would be unique to those cancer cells versus all cells at large. So that they'd have a unique viability.
My question is then, is that ugly capacity isolated to those cells, or is it also present in other of the bazillion genes out there that where it may not be their whole function, but even if you round up these 15, bad guys, you're going to have, maybe the others are partially devoted to the same thing, and you can't kill them because they're holding good functions hostage.
Right. So I think, right. So this is obviously work in cells and culture, right? And so those 15 may have critical roles in our body in many tissues that we haven't looked at. Yeah. And that's potentially one challenge. And of course, we really can't address that easily. We can make a knockout in a mouse, for example, to try to get at that. But the other problem is that even if we went after those 15, there's probably a very good chance that there would be resistance that would develop to inhibitors of those 15. But my view on resistance, and this might be a little bit different than others, is that ultimately the cell can only find so many resistant pathways to go after. There's only so many possibilities. We're not talking about infinite possibilities. Mm-hmm. And part of our hope is that in an iterative way, we'll go after one of those 15, and we'll do this experiment again when we get resistant cells, and we'll find now new genes that matter. And ultimately, that process has to come down to a set of genes that either you can't get resistance to, or that in combination we could deal with this. It's not an infinite problem, right? There's only a certain amount of tools that these cells actually have to get around that. So we're at the early stages, though, of figuring that out.
Okay, thank you very much. That was all just amazing. And thank you to all of you. I am happily armed with good questions from the audience, and if there are more, send them. Thank God. But let me just ask a broad question first, Rick, for you. All right. Now I'll retreat back to metaphor, but I hope you'll then make it concrete. This is a very ambitious goal by 2020, and you're all thinking about it already, and I'm just blown away by how deeply in it you are already. But nevertheless, you're looking for resources and people and time, and not a lot of time, to do this. 5 years. So if this is an old war movie, The Dirty Dozen, and we're all sitting around the table and you're El Comandante here, what is the order of battle that you're laying out? What is the mission for each of these guys? What's the key thing that you need from each of these 3 players and from yourself in your sector specialty to then come back together to solve this?
That's a great question, and you might not have anticipated this, but we need one thing that we already have, which is tremendous independence from one another. And the students and postdocs we train, we like to believe that we give them fantastic guidance, but a feature of them is that they typically do what they want to do. They do what they're inspired to do. And so they create things that are a little different than we imagine. But in the end, they do come around to making these fundamental discoveries and solving the puzzles, because we're giving them tools within a space to solve those puzzles. But the other piece then is chemistry. We need to build within this institute our own chemical capabilities to allow us to try to drug these undruggable entities and to continue to collaborate with really the world's leaders in that space in the academic environment.
I feel like you're being kind to me as a newbie. If you're less meta, maybe you don't get less meta, but maybe you're really meta. But don't you see that Piyush, or this is a military metaphor, so Gupta, bring me, I need this from you.
Yeah.
What do you need from his quarter? What do you need from Sabatini?
Yep. Yep. So we've each described in coded form these nodes, which in each of these cases are protein molecules that do not have a little cleft, a little hole that chemists typically use to drug an entity. And so I ask each of these guys to not throw that out, because historically they would throw it out and we'd move on.
Because it sounded impossible?
It is impossible, but our grad students and postdocs don't know that.
And we're all pledged to silence.
And moreover, I think again, we've mentioned Jay's name many times here, but it's because he's provided some of the inspiration, at least for me, to believe that undruggable is not undruggable. It's simply that the pharmaceutical industry, using its expertise so far, has not succeeded. But we want to succeed in that space, and I believe with work that I've done together with Jay and others in the past, it is going to be possible, and it will be possible in the next 5 years.
Piyush, here's a question from the audience. There's a series of questions that kind of follow one arc of thought on this, but it seems fundamental. The first that I'll put to you is this from the audience. Can this approach, writ large, be described as targeting the furthest upstream node that can be identified?
Sadly, no. Even the notion, when I was a student, I loved to think in terms of upstream and downstream, a linear hierarchy. And as scientists, we need to be reductionist in our thinking. It can't all be a jumbled mess. But the reality is the situation is combinatorial, right? So there really is no upstream. There is no downstream. This node that I spoke of, there are 3 different factors, none of which are upstream or downstream, that collectively nucleate on these regions in the DNA known as super enhancers to activate these pro-invasive genes. So the problem is we can't think of it anymore in terms of upstream and downstream. We have to think of it in terms of complex networks where groups of genes in the network nucleate to activate certain nodes. And that's why I say sadly no, because if there was one upstream, an Uber form, as Plato liked to refer to it, we'd go after that. But there is no one node at the top of it. So if you
solve this by 2020 and you conquer the cell OS and you've got the insight and learned how to manipulate it therapeutically, there's still something not upstream, downstream, sideways that may come in and incite the same problems that you're trying to address here?
Well, I think there are 2 things that are very helpful there. There are 2 ways of looking at it. One is we don't need to characterize the entire network. We need to characterize that aspect of the network that's important for malignant cancer cells. So we know what those properties are. Their invasiveness, their multi-drug resistance, and in the case of a malignant cancer, survival is something we don't want, right? So if we just focus on those phenotypes and use genome-wide strategies, we won't know everything there is to know about the cell. I think that's unrealistic to think that we're going to understand everything there is to know about the biology in the next 5 years. I think that's impossible. But in terms of the ambitious timeline, I do think it is very possible that we could identify all of the nodes and the factors that cooperatively act on those nodes for all of the phenotypes that we care about for malignant cancer cells. I think that's very much doable.
Okay, once again, yes.
To make it clear, although David Sabatini didn't say it, his work will, over the next several years, define the outer boundaries of the universe of critically important nodes. It's no longer going to be a mysterious, foggy unknown. One will be able to say, here we can enumerate all of these critically important nodes. That doesn't tell us which ones will be therapeutically highly advantageous, but he's going to give us a shopping list of them, and thereby give other people.
Let me put this broad question then on this front, and I don't know if it captures every nuance of what you just described, but I relate to this question is from the audience, and given the heterogeneity of cancer, how do you know such common nodes even exist? Now, maybe you just told us, and we...
Yeah, I think that, and you guys could probably elaborate on this. My view is there is heterogeneity, but there usually is an inciting mutation at the beginning of some of these cancers that actually persists throughout even the heterogeneous population. So that whatever the dependencies are for that particular mutation, I would hope we'd be able to target. There certainly is evidence where you get divergence from that. But I still think that we're talking about a limited problem. It's an enormous, difficult problem, but it's not an infinite problem. And to me, that's what this type of approach has helped understand, is that we're talking about large numbers here, but they're not infinite numbers. They're certainly within the capacity of what we can do. And so, sure, there's going to be new nodes that emerge over progression, but I think we'll be able to find them.
A serious, responsible scientist would not have used those words 3, 5, or 10 years ago. But he's talking very specifically about creating these lists of critically important genes.
This possibility, you mean?
Well, he already has the technology in hand to do it. It's not simply a vague, inchoate fog that somehow obstructs our forward advance.
So then this question, then, Bob, what is the probability? Let's say you identify these and you go to work on them. What is the probability of another node picking up the role of the destroyed node?
We can't say that at present. However, Rick's experience already indicates that hitting a critical node aggressively in a group of cancer cells has such a devastating effect on the population of cancer cells that the likelihood of a variant emerging that develops resistance to that initial aggressive therapy could actually be very small. But at this stage, I'm saying that in a very speculative and tentative voice, because we still need to try and do it. But now for the first time there's a glimmer of hope, more than a glimmer, that actually we will be able to deal with a heterogeneous diversity of cancers, each having its own idiosyncratic mutation, that all will succumb quickly to perturbation of a common node that they all share together, and it's critical to their ongoing viability and aggressiveness.
Are you chomping at the bit to elaborate on that?
But I will.
Yes, please.
Tom, there's a...
Are you glad I said that?
No, I'm not glad you said that, but thank you for your contribution. There is a feature of very aggressive cancer cells that is common to all those we've studied so far, and that is something that others have termed addiction, oncogene addiction. And in my book, that is the idea that a cell becomes so dependent on a node that when you compromise its ability to use it, it simply commits suicide. It cannot, there isn't the time for it to adopt a new strategy to circumvent. So this concept of addiction, I think, is actually being fairly well established for some of these nodes.
What do you most need to accomplish this? We know you need 5 years and $50 million, but within that, what do you need?
The young talent that can do this. I mean, we're very fortunate to be able to attract some of the most brilliant young minds on the earth. Continuing to do that does require financial resources. But in addition, it requires that we have these collaborative abilities that we have now. So I don't know how to amplify on that, except that we're limited almost entirely by finance.
And you said, if I heard you right, you want everyone to go off and do their own thing. You don't want to be, you're collaborating, but you kind of want them to go like their own way.
Because historically what we've found is that we are much more likely to come up with paradigm-shifting, game-changing discoveries if we don't completely believe our own Kool-Aid, that we have the solution here today. But if we have puzzle solvers who we are mentoring, people who are going to be the world's best problem solvers, that's the best way to go forward. We think this construct we've described today is every bit as important as we've tried to describe. it is conceivable that there'll be a resistance thing we didn't anticipate. There'll be another feature of cancer. There's always another level of complexity to biology. So a little bit of freedom here to operate actually enhances the ability to succeed, in my view.
Bob, you've seen generations of these initiatives and efforts and goals and campaigns. Does this feel different to you?
It does. I've been talking in a soft voice, sotto voce, as one says in music, about the limitations of genome sequencing, simply because our colleagues next door at the Broad Institute have invested greatly there. And that has been sold as maybe the future of personalized cancer therapy. But it never really made that much sense to me, simply because I knew about this emergent resistance, and there didn't seem to be any clear conceptual scheme as to how one was going to deal with it. But this discovery now of these critical regulatory nodes, Rick talked about one of them, Piyush talked about again another, really gives me serious, significant, sincere hope that we can deal with a whole diverse array of cancers that may have their own private idiosyncratic mutant genomes, but share in common this dependence, this vulnerability, this sensitivity to being rapidly killed when a critical node is being disrupted. And by the way, when you ask with more specificity what we need, one of the things we'd like to bring in-house is an ability to develop different kinds of chemical agents that could attack specific proteins. That's a capability we lack now, totally, and we need to go to the outside, which obviously can often be done.
Is it within 5 miles of here?
Well, it's been 2 miles. We live here in the greatest ecosystem for biomedical research in the world, at the risk of sounding self-aggrandizing. So it's a 2-mile journey, but it's even better to have the person in the next lab where you can talk on an ongoing, continuous basis, rather than to have to make the arduous journey over the now constricted BU bridge to get to Harvard Medical School.
Piyush, who has the most difficult challenge among your 4 specialties? Is it you?
Well, I think that's tough. You know, you always see the challenges that you're focused on most clearly. So from that point of view, almost by definition, that would be the case. But I do think that the challenges are surmountable. Personally, I never thought that there would be one node like this that would be so important for all of these different cancer cells to invade. And eventually I came to the realization it's that cancer cells don't learn to invade. They turn on circuitry that normal cells have. So they can't mutate their way out of that process. I think the biggest challenge we have now is finding something, as you were getting at in your questions, a drug that patients can benefit from that will target this so-called undruggable node. I think that's a very important thing to do next.
David, when you go home in the evening, assuming you do go home in the evening, and
Sometimes.
Crack a beer or a yogurt, do you lean back and say, yeah, we can do this? Or, Jesus, what have these guys got me into? Or
No, I think we definitely can do it. I think, you know, we sent Rick a couple months ago a list of all the so-called undruggable sort of master regulators, their scores across a whole bunch of breast cancers, right? And so there's clearly data that's already emerging. The part that scares me is a little bit what Piyush said. When we look at the list of, you said those 15, there are 33, a vast majority are ending up in the traditionally undruggable, right? And so when you asked about need, I concur with what Bob, Rick said. I do think it's new chemical approaches. It's new ways of getting at those, because the biology is telling us that the low-hanging fruit from the chemical approach is not going to be enough. And it's incredibly clear in the data sets that we see. And so that's what is the most, I think, challenging aspect of this, is how much sort of uncharted territory is on the chemistry side. We'll get the answers, because this approach that we use is unbiased. It doesn't care what the gene is. We'll get the answers, but translating that into actual therapies, I think, is obviously the hard part. So.
The traditional role of a moderator is to wrap up, and today, this is beyond my capacity. But I will say,
you're a polymath.
Yeah, maybe, but this is more dimensions than I'm accustomed to. And I think I will just, for my part, and I'll give it back to David, but wrap by First of all, I feel like I heard Yoda speak here today when you said, Piyush, there is no upstream, no downstream. That is going to stick with me. And in spite of that multiverse of streams, I guess I go away, yes, heartened and amazed, but also just humbled and inspired by your boldness in stepping out into this with this kind of confidence and expertise to take it on, and with both the joy of excitement that comes from that and an awareness of the deep human importance of you succeeding. I wish you well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.